At the time of this video's recording, I've watched roughly 32% of One Piece. And honestly, I was hesitant to make this video knowing I'm still pretty early in the span of Straw Hat history. But with Thriller Bark on my horizon, there's one impactful moment in the series I've wanted to touch on that took One Piece to a new and different kind of emotional level that I had never seen up till then. For a shonen that had mastered emotional gravitas through more than 200 plus episodes, this was the first time I'd felt something very relatable, personal, and dare I say real. I'm talking about the famous argument between Usopp and Luffy that takes place in Water 7 that leads to Usopp leaving the Straw Hats. Going back to that point about emotional gravitas, One Piece was definitely no stranger to dialing up emotion at pivotal climatic spots. The series did this by setting the story up with a hopeless situation that Luffy and the gang could overcome in the name of things like friendship, honor, and just doing the right thing. And these dire situations were crafted to be impossibly high hurdles to overcome, allowing the emotional payoff to be extremely rewarding by the end of it. And One Piece first mastered this intense drama setup and payoff with the Arlong Park Walk. If we recall back to East Blue, Nami has realized her efforts over the years to collect enough money to free her village from Arlong and his pirates have been all for naught. As her village marches off for one last stand against the Fish Man, she finally understands the debt she has chased so long to free herself from can never truly be repaid, especially if the village she's fought so desperately for will soon meet their end anyway. In these early episodes of the series, Nami only uses Luffy and the Straw Hats as a means to get what she needed to fulfill this sole mission, all the while constantly resisting Luffy's offer to join the Straw Hats crew. But now, in her weakest, most broken and desperate moment where she feels all hope is lost, Luffy shows up by her side, and she finally drops her pride to ask him for help. Without hesitation, Luffy gives his hat to Nami to show that he trusts her with his most prized possession, so in turn she'll trust him to take care of her and face down her enemy. Simply put, because that's what friends do. For all the many times she's turned him away, Luffy and the rest of the guys don't even second guess themselves to fight for her. And as they do that famous walk side by side to confront an impossibly strong enemy like Arlong, we get to see what One Piece is really all about, to show what real friendship looks like when it matters the most. And boy did it work. The Arlong Park Walk set that family precedent in the series, and exemplified how loyalty and friendship is paramount to the Straw Hat Code. And it did it in such a satisfying way that it made you want to root for and appreciate the Straw Hats as a family. And no matter how high the stakes were for every subsequent adventure through both Alabasta and Skypiea, that family element remained intact and rarely, if ever, felt in jeopardy. But what happens when a crew member is no longer able to continue? What does it say about the Straw Hats if they're forced to leave someone behind? For how simple the Arlong Park Walk defined what it meant to be a friend, the story of the Going Merry's inevitable end only complicated the values Luffy and the gang had held in such high regard. And it would force these characters to face certain challenges not dressed as an evil villain. Which brings us to the argument between Luffy and Usopp, and how it all started in familiar territory. In the early days of the Straw Hats' arrival in Water 7, there's a scene where Usopp quietly reflects on how monstrously stronger most of the gang has become. Usopp has won some battles in the past before, but they never truly resulted in him achieving any new pillar of strength. Usopp and Nami are the only Straw Hats at this time without some supernatural powers. But unlike Nami, Usopp's specific dream is to become stronger, to visit Elbaf and to learn from the giants on how to become a brave warrior of the sea. But as we've seen in the past, Usopp has been more of a coward in battle, and while he was able to win some battles by tapping into that brave part of himself, he still hadn't made any major leaps in becoming the warrior he wishes to be. And as he's now watching the gap widen between himself and Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, Robin, and even Chopper, it makes sense that Usopp would start to question if he's able to keep up any longer, chasing that benchmark of strength he feels is necessary to be a Straw Hat pirate. At first, I didn't know why this scene was taking place, but after being jumped by the Frankie family and allowing them to steal the pirates' 200 million berries, Usopp is devastated by his lack of strength. When Nami finds him on the streets beaten, you can feel his shame, so to prove to himself and everyone else that he's not weak, he shows up at the Frankie house alone to attempt to get the money back, but they humiliate and beat him down again, deliberately mocking his weakness the entire time before leaving him a broken man for the Straw Hats to find. This is where the familiar territory comes into play. When Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and Chopper find Usopp, they share this quiet moment before performing the best deja vu Arlong Park walk to avenge Usopp. It was the simplest of callbacks to remind us where we started with this journey and how that message still rang true now. But this mirroring of the Arlong Park walk would also serve as misdirection. As quickly as it helps you remember what you've come to expect in a payoff moment like this, it's only short-lived, with that expectation being shattered by the shocking fallout of Luffy and Usopp's argument that would come soon after. In what seems like a hopeful moment after Usopp recovers back on the ship, Luffy breaks the news that he's decided to leave the Merry behind to continue their journey on a new ship, leaving Usopp in disbelief. At first, he blames himself for losing the money and leaving them unable to afford the repairs they were planning. He thinks Luffy is just being considerate by purchasing a new ship instead of burdening him with any guilt for getting jumped and robbed. But then Luffy lets Usopp know that the Merry is beyond repair and that his decision is final, and Usopp completely rejects the notion. As they start to argue, there's so much happening from each character's emotional stance at this moment. Usopp's just been physically and emotionally humiliated twice. While he's suffering from his own insecurities, he now discovers the ship gifted to the crew by his dear friend Kaya, the same ship he's acted as a makeshift shipwright for all this time, taking care of her every inch of the way, is being left behind. Usopp also doesn't sense any pain or remorse in Luffy's reaction to the news, making him only get angrier and let his own fear be projected onto how he thinks Luffy sees the Merry as something mostly unimportant and broken. Luffy's reaction was one I had never seen before. As Usopp refuses to let up on the argument, Luffy also lashes out in anger, hurt and confused that one of his best friends is showing such hostility towards him for a decision that wasn't easy for him to make. He's conflicted between his roles as captain and friend, trying to demand respect as a leader while showing compassionate regret for his choices. But as Usopp continues to argue, he finally pushes Luffy to his limits, and he starts to tell him that if he doesn't like his decision, then he can leave altogether, something you never thought you'd ever hear Luffy say to another Straw Hat. But Sanji quickly shuts him down with a kick. Understandably upset, he threatens Luffy to not finish his sentence. It's a faithful reminder to the captain that this group's foundation is built on loyalty to each other. And so Luffy apologetically composes himself, remembering his responsibility as leader, but it's too late for Usopp as he fully gives in to his own weakness. Luffy argues it's different between a ship and humans, but Usopp chalks it up to the fact if the Merry can be abandoned, it's only a matter of time before other weak members of the Straw Hats are discarded as well. Despite just being saved by the people he calls his closest friends, in a scene that mirrored the moment the Straw Hats solidified themselves as a family, Usopp is prepared to throw everything away in an attempt to selfishly free himself from the shame of being too weak. He tells Luffy he can't live looking ahead like he does, meaning he's content to anchor himself to the past and give up on any potential growth that could come in the future. And with this, Usopp announces he's leaving the gang, leaving the Straw Hats devastated and shell-shocked. And then to stubbornly double down on his decision, he challenges Luffy to a duel for the Merry. But you knew before it even started that Luffy would easily win. With Usopp already struggling to not feel weak, it's hard to watch him give it his all to no avail. And then as a sign of respect for Usopp's wishes, Luffy doesn't hold back, knowing he doesn't wish any harm on his already beaten down friend. Usopp is able to stand his ground for a short while, but Luffy eventually puts the duel to an end with a final blow. Afterwards, Sanji doesn't let Chopper treat the unconscious Usopp as a mercy to not let him feel any more weak or pathetic than he already does. And even though he lost the duel, Luffy gives the ship to Usopp anyway, and the episode ends with both men in tears over their choices. Like I mentioned in the introduction, this was a new emotional level I had never witnessed in One Piece, We were getting sides of these characters never seen before, and it was painful to watch them fight a battle neither of them had a chance of winning. But as a setup, this argument became the failure that forced the characters to evaluate themselves differently, introspectively and emotionally, making way for a more compelling journey that led to a different kind of fulfilling resolution and payoff. Usopp's departure is the first event that sets the Water 7 arc into motion, and the rest of the story doesn't hesitate to get started with the assassination attempt on Iceberg and the discovery that Robin has joined CP9 soon thereafter. We're only given this brief moment on the rooftop to see how the gang is managing the loss of their friend. You really get the sense of dread and regret these characters feel as they try to process what's happened, what it means, and ultimately how to move on. But the real gravity of the situation falls on Usopp trying to come to terms about how he really feels inside. And we start to see this internal battle after he and Mary are abducted by Frankie. While riding out Aqua Laguna, Frankie ends up taking a liking to Usopp. He sees the resiliency and pride that Usopp takes in repairing the Mary. As a former shipwright himself, he recognizes the great care he's provided for her, but Frankie isn't blind to the fact that Mary is done for. He goes on to ask Usopp theoretically what he'd do once he fixes her. Usopp replies that of course they'll go on more adventures and eventually return to his hometown triumphantly, having at least accomplished reaching the Grand Line and leaving it to that alone to be the peak of his successes. Usopp is relying on the past because he's afraid of what the future holds. He has a lot of complacency and comfort in holding on to what's familiar, like the Mary and thoughts of home. This sort of thing is easier to lean on than accepting the future, especially one with the Straw Hats, knowing it'll bring both uncertain change and greater challenges than before. But Usopp's dug himself into a hole, convinced that he's not suited or strong enough for either. Eventually, Frankie tries to show him some tough love by ripping part of the ship off and making Usopp see for himself the unfixable damage below, but Usopp just refuses to quit. As he picks up his repairs yet again, we admire the devotion he has to fix the Mary, but it's frustrating to watch him selfishly refuse to detach himself from the ship. He finally admits to Frankie, though, that in his heart he knows it's over. He remembers back on Skypiea when the shadowy figure fixed the Mary up. Frankie tells Usopp that it was Klabauterman, the fairy of legend that watches over sailors' ships, especially the ones well taken care of, acting as a sort of spirit for their vessel. He suspects the ship must have been very happy for it to take a human form to fix itself and carry the crew once more. But that's the truth that Usopp continues to deny. Accepting that the Mary is fulfilled and therefore acknowledging her journey is complete is something that he just won't accept. Seeing through the situation, Frankie insists that Usopp return to his friends, but he flatly refuses. It's not that simple, Usopp says. In a way, it felt like he was talking about the drastic shift in tone the show had taken. Before in One Piece there were no internal conflicts within this group, but now it was more complicated. And Usopp's struggle right now was to know the difference between never giving up and learning to let go. From there, Usopp spends the remainder of the arc mostly disguised as Soja King, and his arc for the most part is put on hold until the end. But where his story was paused, the floodgates were now open to other similar expositions that remain in this vein of tone. Like many of the Straw Hats, Robin and Frankie's stories focused on their beginnings, but also the trauma they experienced from childhood to adulthood and how it influenced them to be who they are today. But the impressive part of watching this unfold was how their stories would overlap with the lessons Usopp was struggling to learn, regarding both himself and his perceptions about the Mary's end. Like Usopp, Robin also leaves the Straw Hats at the beginning of the arc, giving herself up to CP9 to avoid the gang getting prosecuted by the world government. But as we start to learn about her past in her own private flashbacks, we find out why it's so hard for her to trust others and why it's so difficult for her to accept any rescue from the Straw Hats. Since her childhood, Robin struggled to fit in back on her home island of Ohara. She longed for her mother who was away, and most of her time was spent buried in books and getting bullied by other kids. So she relished in learning from the other Ohara archaeologists to become one herself. But once the world government issues a buster call and kills everyone, including her recently returned mother, the entire archaeology group, and her new giant friend Saul in their efforts to protect her, it makes sense that this sort of trauma would keep her reluctant to make any new connections. She ends up spending most of her life being rejected, so she stays hidden in the shadows. Eventually, she comes to adopt an opportunistic mindset. To achieve her dream, she only uses people as a stepping stone before leaving them altogether. But it's that classic Straw Hat effort to convince her that she's more than worth their trouble that makes her finally realize she has to take responsibility for what's always been present in her heart. A long-lost desire for connection and friendship, and how she has to be the one to ask for it, which she eventually does. It's her resolve to move forward that contrasts nicely against Usopp's resistance to change and not taking any accountability for his feelings. And it's her bravery that she shows by letting down that well-guarded Nico Robin persona we come to know that might have inspired Usopp to not be so hasty to give up on the dream that he has not only for himself, but the collective Straw Hats' dream as a whole, the one where they vowed to make all of their dreams come true together. Franky grew up a broken delinquent, abandoned by his pirate parents, but taken in by the great shipwright Tom. Over the years, Tom taught Franky to love life and take pride in the things he created. Together with the rest of Tom's workers, they put Water 7 back on the map by creating the water train, the Puffing Tom. All this time, Franky spends his free time building battleships, but he doesn't take any responsibility for the potential harm that could be used for by others, as Iceberg called him out for. And that does in fact become the case when Franky's ships are eventually blamed for a disaster that he didn't commit. But Tom takes the fall for him, and Franky is left with guilt and regret as his mentor is sentenced off to Enies Lobby. But the fishman won't take any of his sulking. He demands Franky still be proud of the ships he built, no matter the cause they were used for. His philosophy is to reject the things you build is to reject who you are, and Tom is willing to die to protect those shipwright values. Franky completes his arc by becoming the shipwright for the Straw Hats. He's able to finally forgive himself for just being who he is, and so he picks back up his dream to sail the world in a ship of his creation, leaving behind the guilt and remorse for the past and living life to the fullest as Tom would want him to do. Shipwright culture is a big part of Water 7's story overall, and particularly using ships as a story device. Their construction, their destruction, their repairs, and their innovation was used brilliantly, with Mary's Inn being such a focal point. And we get to see so much of the shipwright code through Franky's backstories that adds meaning to the craftsmanship, love, and personality that goes into shipbuilding. This all helps to cast the Going Merry in a more human light, making Usopp's position on saving the Merry a more sympathetic one. We really get the impression that ships are more than just a thing. While that doesn't justify Usopp's refusal to let go, it does help us relate to his position. Mary is a fallen and injured crewmate like himself, but that doesn't make her weak. She might be done for, but one's ending doesn't correlate with weakness, as we'll see in the payoff. Usopp, on the other hand, is nowhere near done. He just keeps choosing weakness over the acceptance of what is. Like with Franky's story, Usopp has to let go of what's already been done and can no longer be changed, and live his life in a way that he thought he couldn't, looking ahead like Luffy does. One complete and to its fullest, just as Mary had done. We've covered One Piece's ability to create effective setup and how that influenced the tone of other character arcs in Water 7. But the overall payoff for the saga is where the real powerful effect was delivered, and it came in two moments: Mary's rescue of the Straw Hats, and Usopp's apology. For the Mary's rescue, the idea of a broken ship becoming sentient to do a rescue mission was a silly thought at first. But watching Usopp's restless efforts to save her and the focus on ships as a whole throughout the arc made an implausible moment feel more magical rather than ridiculous. As the crew fights off the swarming military that continues to pour into Enies Lobby, they eventually find themselves hopelessly surrounded with no method of escape. But then their eyes catch what's arrived and waiting for them below, and we get this scene where their faces tell the story more than anything. They all have a look that's carefree, filled with complete trust and faith, and an overwhelming sense of comforting relief. This was the Mary's version of the Arlong Park walk, leaving her final mark by being there for her friends when it mattered the most. And for a brief second after they made their escape, you start to believe that perhaps the assessments about Mary were wrong. Maybe Usopp was right and she did have more time in her and that things could go back to the way they were. Maybe One Piece could and would always return back to its innocent roots where no one was ever left behind, there were no consequences or need for sacrifice, and friendship would always have the final say. But once she carries the Straw Hats to safety, the miracle runs out and she finally breaks. Luffy begs out to Iceberg to save and fix her. Though he's still masked as Soja King, I like to believe Usopp appreciated hearing Luffy's painful plea out loud for the ship to be saved. But Iceberg tells them to let her rest, and so they come to peace with the reality of the situation. For her funeral, Luffy sets her ablaze and tells the ship, "The sea is cold and dark, so we'll stay with you till the end." Usopp remarks he still doesn't agree that it is the end for her, but chooses to not stand in the way. It's sort of a beautiful, imperfect moment that leaves you immensely sad but reverent. As she burns, Luffy cries out in remorse and begs for forgiveness from the ship. But her voice responds back and assures them that she was indeed happy with her life. It's somber and bittersweet, and the Straw Hats weep for their friend they finally allowed themselves to let go of. Using Usopp's apology as the last action to take place in Water 7 worked really well on a symbolic level. As the crew begins to depart, Usopp makes his way through town to catch the ship, running through various things to say to get himself back into the gang without addressing the elephant in the room. Though the crew knows Usopp wants to return, Zoro prevents Luffy from inviting him back on his own. He makes it clear that Usopp has to apologize for abandoning them, otherwise he wouldn't be able to respect Luffy as a captain. Zoro's stance on the issue ensures they still live by their code, and if Usopp were to return without holding himself accountable for his actions, then the Straw Hats would be at an even greater risk to lose more of who they are than before. Internal strife may have forced these characters to confront very complicated situations, but nothing could be complicated about who the Straw Hats are. Luffy adheres to Zoro's message, understanding that Usopp this time is the one responsible for rescuing and restoring this family to what it once was. As they continue their departure on their new ship, the Thousand Sunny, they intentionally linger to leave enough time for Usopp to show up. But then Luffy's grandpa Garp attacks them, so they must defend themselves, leaving no time for sweet talk or any deception that Usopp may be planning. Once he arrives at the docks, he realizes they've already set sail, and we start to see Usopp's insecurities all over again. He believes he's earned the right to come back because he fought alongside them once again at Enies Lobby, but as he's literally being left behind, he reverts back to those feelings of not being good enough or worthy, believing this is an act done upon him and not by him. Usopp is cornered and once again left with a choice, to let fear win over him or to accept the only thing he knows to be true in his heart, that he wants to continue being a Straw Hat. And finally, he's able to let go. That idea of pride being his beacon of strength is thrown away, and he shows his real strength by being vulnerable, apologetic, and humbled as he screams out that he's sorry to his crewmates. Immediately, a weight is lifted off of the crew and Usopp. All is instantly forgiven, the past is permanently put behind them, and their friendship is restored. And with one stretched out arm, Luffy shows Usopp that he's plenty enough to be a Straw Hat pirate. Between Mary's funeral and this scene, it was a wonderful payoff for what had been a long journey that had first been set up by one simple argument between Usopp and Luffy.